In the year 1274, shortly after his death, Saint Thomas Aquinas did not simply disappear from the Dominican world. Within the quiet walls of a monastery library, something unexpected began to unfold, remembered not as legend, but as a moment of reverent uncertainty among devoted brothers. Saint Thomas Aquinas had spent his life among books, prayer, and disciplined silence. For the Dominican friars who survived him, his absence felt incomplete, as if his vocation had not ended with burial. That sense would soon deepen, in ways none of them openly anticipated. Not long after his passing, several friars recorded an unusual presence in the library, where theology students studied late into the night. They did not describe fear, but a calm awareness, as if someone unseen was guiding thought rather than commanding attention. The witnesses emphasized that no voice was heard and no form clearly seen. Yet books seemed open to the right pages, confusion settled into clarity, and students later spoke of insights arriving gently, as though received rather than discovered through effort alone. For Dominicans formed by obedience and discernment, such experiences were not proclaimed publicly. They were written quietly, weighed carefully, and shared only within the order. What unsettled them was not the mystery itself, but how familiar the presence seemed. Those who studied under Thomas during his lifetime recalled his habit of guiding students without spectacle. He corrected gently, waited patiently, and allowed understanding to rise within the soul. The library presence mirrored that same spiritual pedagogy, almost unmistakably. At the time, Thomas was not yet canonized, but his reputation for sanctity was already strong. His intellectual discipline had always been inseparable from prayer, fasting, and humility, making the idea of continued guidance feel consistent with his lifelong spiritual labor. The monastery itself carried memory. Stone corridors echoed with centuries of study, and the library was more than a room. It was a place of formation. That such a manifestation occurred there seemed deliberate, yet no explanation was offered aloud. Some brothers wondered whether this was consolation for students struggling with faith and reason. Others suspected it was a test of discernment rather than a miracle to be admired. No conclusion was forced, leaving space for reverence instead of certainty. What remained consistent was silence. The accounts ended without resolution, only noting that study continued. Prayer deepened, and the unseen guidance eventually faded. Yet for those present, the question lingered. Had Thomas truly ever left that library? As the reports quietly circulated within the Dominican order, attention turned toward the students themselves. Many were young men wrestling with theology late at night, torn between reason and devotion, unaware that their private struggles were being observed beyond ordinary human presence. Several students later described moments when complex arguments suddenly aligned. Questions left unresolved during study seemed answered without explanation, not through sudden brilliance, but through a calm ordering of thought that felt patiently guided rather than forcefully imposed. In Dominican formation, study was never separated from prayer. The library hours were framed by silence, rosary, and examination of conscience. That context shaped how the friars interpreted the presence, as something emerging from obedience rather than curiosity or desire. Some elders recalled Thomas himself insisting that knowledge served salvation only when ordered toward humility. His Summa had been written under obedience, not ambition. The idea that such guidance continued after death felt consistent with how he had always approached teaching. The accounts carefully avoided the word miracle. Instead, they spoke of accompaniment. Nothing disrupted routine. Meals were eaten, bells rang and classes continued. Yet, beneath ordinary rhythm, an invisible pedagogy seemed briefly active, then gradually withdrawn. This restraint reflected Thomas's own final words, remembered within the order. Near the end of his life, he had claimed all he wrote seemed like straw before divine reality. That humility framed how his continued presence, if real, would remain discreet. Younger friars found reassurance rather than spectacle. They spoke of perseverance during long study, patience in confusion, and renewed commitment to prayer. No one claimed to see Thomas clearly, yet many felt strengthened in vocation without knowing why. Within the monastery, these moments were treated as gifts carrying responsibility. Discernment was urged, not excitement. The brothers were reminded that true signs never draw attention to themselves, but quietly direct souls back toward discipline and trust. As months passed, the library returned fully to silence. No new accounts were added, and earlier notes remained sealed in archives. Yet among those who studied during that season, a shared memory endured, spoken rarely, but never dismissed. What unsettled later readers of these accounts was not what happened, but what did not. There was no command, no prophecy, no spectacle. Only guidance given and withdrawn, leaving behind a deeper question about obedience beyond death. Years later, when Thomas Aquinas was canonized, earlier library accounts were reread with new restraint. What once felt ambiguous now carried weight, not as proof, but as continuity, suggesting a vocation that had not ended with earthly breath. Dominican communities preserved the memory without embellishment. It was shared during formation talks, not sermons, emphasizing fidelity to study and prayer. The focus remained on what the presence produced, steadier discipline rather than astonishment or fear. The library itself became a silent witness. Generations studied there, unaware of the older notes, yet shaped by the same rhythm Thomas loved. Books, candles, and quiet desks continued forming minds ordered toward truth and humility. For those who believed, the episode suggested that teaching is a form of charity extending beyond time. Thomas had once said, "Love orders knowledge." If love endures, some wondered, might guidance endure as well, quietly and briefly? Others remained cautious, insisting that the church needs no signs to validate truth. Study itself was sufficient. Yet even among the cautious, there was agreement that something had strengthened perseverance during that season, leaving an imprint without explanation. Letters from former students, written years later, described lives shaped by disciplined study and parish service. None claimed certainty about the presence, yet many traced their vocation to nights when confusion lifted without visible cause. In time, the story traveled beyond Europe through Dominican teaching houses. It was received not as spectacle, but as encouragement for students balancing work, family, and study, seeking fidelity amid long nights and ordinary responsibilities. What endured was a lesson aligned with Thomas's theology. Grace perfects nature without replacing it. No shortcut was offered. Books were still read, prayers still said, effort still required, even if help seemed near and unseen. The accounts closed with humility, refusing to settle the mystery. They invited readers to imitate Thomas, not by seeking signs, but by committing to disciplined love of truth, trusting that fidelity bears fruit in ways unseen. Whether presence or providence, the memory remained gentle. The library returned to silence, yet study continued with renewed seriousness. And somewhere between pages and prayer, the question lingered, unanswered, inviting faith rather than conclusion.